Welcome to the second of our classes on the book of Ecclesiastes. This class was originally presented on 7th April to a Zoom audience for the British Bible School, and this recording is being made on 9th April. Just to review where we were in chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes. The theme of the book seems that runs through it that the teacher, and as we believe that to be Solomon, says that everything that he looks around and sees is meaningless, it's futile, it's perfectly pointless. What we see here is him, we believe, to be at the end of his life and looking back on what he's done, and he just can't see any point to life. In fact, as he looks at life in general, what benefit is there to be gained under the sun, on the earth? He talked about various things that just go on and on forever. And he considered that to be very, very tedious. The outline that we're looking at is this one here. So we're in chapter 2 this week. So we're going to be continuing the idea of looking at wisdom and madness and foolishness. And that's really going to be emphasized in this particular chapter. In chapter 2, what we're going to see is this. We're going to see the futility of wisdom and foolishness, and looking in particular at an examination of pleasure. And as we look at this, is that what many people today look at to give them meaning in life? They live for pleasure. So we're going to be looking at that. We're going to look at a conclusion that he arrives at, and that is that wisdom is better, but. So we'll be considering that but. And then the last thing we see in chapter 2 is as he thinks about work, work alone does not bring fulfillment. So one of the points we've been seeing as we've been going through this, as you saw at the end of chapter 1, that wisdom really isn't what gives a meaning in life. He says it's like chasing the wind. And the problem with wisdom and knowledge is it gives you demands and responsibilities, and it only brings really frustration and heartache. So he ended chapter 1 with basically saying, so what's the point? What's the point? So we'll get to chapter 2, and we'll be looking at the futility of wisdom and folly. The first 11 verses are an examination of pleasure. So I'm going to be reading it from the New International Version. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasures of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. And yet, when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. So he's looking at, does pleasure this particular self-indulgent pleasure, that's the way the Net Bible translates it, does this make life worth living? So he's going to indulge himself in pleasure. Now he's very much conducting an experiment. So it's experiment sort of a controlled conditions so that he can see is this truly what gives meaning to life? And before we get into it, isn't this where so many people today try to find meaning in life? I worked for a couple of summers while studying at Freed Hardeman at a poultry processing plant in eastern West Virginia. It very much was assembly line work, or possibly deassembly line work, however you want to look at it. I was in packing chickens, dead chickens. When it came to the end of the week, almost all those working would talk about what they would do over the weekend. It's centered around having fun. It's centered around partying. It's centered often around getting drunk or even worse. And I learned very quickly that those I worked with who were working in this plant as their vocation for life, that they lived to party. They worked so they could have pleasure, or at least what they thought was pleasure. And this is what Solomon is going to examine here. New Time, in the Tyndale commentary on Ecclesiastes, wrote this: in the phrase, "let me test you by pleasure," he informs his heart of his intention to observe its reactions to its exposure of it to pleasurable experiences, which are about to begin, and charges it to report its own rational and emotional responses to him for further evaluation. It's interesting, he has an initial conclusion there that it's meaningless, absolutely meaningless. He notes, Derek Kidner says, at once the paradox of hedonism, that the more you hunt for pleasure, the less of it you find. And isn't that the truth? Isn't that what so many people around us discover? That when we live for pleasure, it ends up being just having less and less enjoyment of life. So he begins this examination of pleasure. What of partying? That's the way the Net Bible puts it. Or what of laughter, as the NIV had it? He says, well, it's foolishness. It's foolishness. Self-indulgent pleasure? He says it really accomplishes nothing. Well, what about indulging yourself with alcohol? Boy, a lot of people do that, don't they? And behaving foolishly. I mean, the caricature over the years has been that the man works all week and then he gets his pay packet and he goes to the pub and drinks a lot of it away. See, now Solomon's thinking about all these things. And by the way, he says he's trying all these things, but notice he says he's keeping his mind clear so that he can have a fair examination. He's allowing his mind to guide him with wisdom so that he can discover what it was that people could do profitably during their few days of life on the earth. So when you think about that he's trying excessive alcohol, but he's keeping his mind clear. Perhaps Danny Petrillo has the right idea. Apparently not too much wine was consumed because his mind continued to guide him wisely. Therefore, he did not get drunk, or at least he must not have gotten drunk. This was an attempt, Petrillo says, to participate in pleasure without being distracted by it. That seems to be what he's trying to do, to indulge himself in it, and yet to be somewhat separated from it so he can look at it with an objective viewpoint. So he begins to indulge himself. Derek Kidner wrote, as if he had overreacted in turning to the futile pleasures, he now gives himself to the joys of creativity. He bends his energies to a project worthy of his aesthetic gifts, his grasp of skills and sciences, and his ability to command a great establishment. And that's very much what we see him doing. He increases his possessions, and I have no idea what they were. I do know that they weren't nice, fancy Bentleys, as we have pictured in this picture, but undoubtedly was the equivalent of what we'd have today of expensive cars, expensive yachts, or whatever else it is that people enjoy. This particular car, by the way, belongs to the Duchess of Northumberland, who lives at Alnwick Castle. We saw her pull in there last summer and get out of the car and walk into the castle. And I took a picture of her car because I thought it's a really, really nice car. But that's the type of thing that wealthy people, even today, still do. He built houses for himself. This seems to be apart from the palace and the temple that we read about in First Kings. And don't rich people do that today? This here is Edgerston House near Jedburgh. Some of the drawings and plans for it. We were there in some of the smaller properties on the estate on holiday this past summer. And I was able to take a picture of the plans for it. But yeah, he did the same thing. These huge, big houses he apparently built for himself as well. He planted vineyards, designed royal gardens and parks, planted all sorts of fruit trees in them. Probably similar to like some of the stuff we read about in Song of Solomon. Uh, don't the wealthy still do that today? You visit the castles, and they usually have some really well kept gardens, usually being kept as they were when the people lived there. These are the formal gardens at Glom's Castle, which we visited last summer. And yeah, very well laid out, very beautiful, lovely to visit. And he also constructed pools of water for the purpose of irrigation, in particular to water the trees he had planted. Interesting, southwest of Jerusalem, in the valley of Artis, their archaeologists have discovered 3 stone pools, and these have been known traditionally as the pools of Solomon. So perhaps that's where he did it. But even today, at the great houses that we visit, uh, you find water features. This one here in the picture is at Chatsworth down in England. And they have many waterworks, water features on that particular estate. But that's what he was doing as well. As Derek Kidner commented, he creates a little world within a world, multiform, harmonious, exquisite, a secular Garden of Eden, full of civilized and agreeably uncivilized delights, with no forbidden fruits or none that he regards as such. I think you can see in the description of all that he's done that it would have required quite a bit of planning and quite a bit of funding. But we saw last week that in our first lesson that he was wealthy. This may seem more than we can relate to because, yes, we can visit these houses, but we can't do those things ourselves. But if we simply think about this as gardening on a large scale, maybe we can see there's some application to us as well. Because we too can get so absorbed in decorating our house to make sure our house is on the highest standard, to have our gardens look supreme. And that's somewhat what he's doing. But that's not all, is it? His indulgence continues. He began to acquire more and more slaves, both male and female. In addition to these, he had slaves that were born in his house. But the question he asks himself, maybe the question we should ask, did owning people really provide any type of joy and satisfaction? I think to ask the question is to answer it. But these are some servants that are on display at Edinburgh Castle. Um, but he had servants galore. And then, of course, livestock, both cows and sheep. He says he had more than either of his predecessors had. These sheep here, by the way, are some of the flocks at Edgerston Estate that were right near the house where we were staying down in the Scottish borders. He began to acquire gold and silver, in addition to valuable treasures taken from various kingdoms and provinces. And we can see that in some of the great estates that we visit, can't we? Again, this is in Chatsworth. And one thing I enjoyed visiting in Chatsworth, they encouraged you to photograph the house because their idea is that this house belongs to the people of Britain. And so it was lovely to take pictures. And it was very much a gilded place. Family still lives there, by the way, which was good. This, by the way, is the State Music Room there at Chatsworth. Just to get an idea of how much wealth Solomon had. In 1 Kings, we read that he received 666 talents of gold each year. Now, a talent was roughly 30.3 kilos, or if you think like me, 67 pounds. Not pounds value, but pounds weight. Now, Solomon, if he's receiving 666 talents of gold each year, that's 666 times those numbers. So that would be the equivalent of having received 20,179 kilos, or 44,622 pounds of gold annually. So what does that mean? What is that worth? Well, I looked up the value. This is as of April the 7th. The value of that today, gold on the 7th of April, was selling at $52,736.24 per kilo. And that translates into pounds. The exchange rate was $1.23 on Tuesday, so that would translate to 42,874 pounds and 99p. I could have rounded it up, but I thought I'd just leave it as it was. So again, he's receiving, that's how much gold is per kilo. He's receiving 20,000 plus kilos of this per year. So what would that be? Again, multiplying that out, he was receiving annually 865,174,423 pounds per year. And that's just the 666 that he received annually. There's other gold that they brought in as well. That is almost, in more modern terms, 1 billion pounds each year, equivalent today. You think he was wealthy? He was excruciating wealthy. But it doesn't stop there, does it? He continues that list of things that he was enjoying. He said he acquired male and female singers. He could have had live singers, the best pop stars that you could have. This, by the way, is Solus, the group that I sing with, singing at St. Giles Cathedral last year. Maybe the equivalent for us would be having the best stereo system that money could buy, or being able to afford to go to hear the concerts, at least once this pandemic is over, going to hear the concerts of the great musicians of our day. And to top it all off, he had a harem of beautiful concubines for sensual pleasure. And I do not have any photos. Was going to show of that. But he's having all of these things. You could basically say if it existed in 900 BC, he had it. He says he was far wealthier than his predecessors, but he did manage to maintain his objectivity in what he acquired. But anything he wanted, he got. He didn't withhold anything from himself. And this, by the way, is the table service at Inverary Castle. And this was very much, several of the pictures I've been showing that I haven't identified had been from Inverary Castle, which I visited for the umpteenth time last summer. But again, they're allowing photography inside their castle now, so it's lovely to be able to go around and remember all these lovely articles that you get to see. Now, what's interesting about Solomon as he analyzes this, he did it for himself. See, throughout the section, he uses a personal pronoun 19 times in verses 4 to 8. In 5 verses, all that does is emphasizes that he did it for himself. You know, that's almost 4 personal pronouns per verse. You see, he wanted to try it all, and he did. Anything he thought could bring him pleasure, he had it. And notice, he did enjoy his accomplishments. He did find some degree of satisfaction from what he did. He says that was the reward for his efforts. But when he took a step back to analyze it all, to see if this could be what gave a purpose in life, he found it was far short of doing that. He concluded, "Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun." You see, centering his life on his own pleasure just did not give him a satisfying life. And people today discover the same thing, don't they? A life of pleasure is really an empty life. And when it's all over, what do we have? Newt Heim wrote in his commentary this: "The challenge is this: if consumption is not a sure way to happiness, what are the alternatives that the Christian faith can offer believers in order to live happy and fulfilled lives?" And we realize it's not in owning possessions that we as Christians find a fulfilled life. Jesus said, "I've come to bring you life and to bring you an abundant life." But it's not a life centered in acquiring things. It's very much a life centered in Jesus, isn't it? Very much a life centered in imitating Jesus and helping others and glorifying God. So we can have a fulfilled life, but it's not in acquiring things. It's not in pleasure. As we move on, verses 12 to 17. And in these books, we're going to discover that wisdom is better than foolishness. But there's a but here. I'm going to read from verses 12 to 17. "Then I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom, and also madness and folly. What more can the king's successor do than what has already been done? I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise have eyes in their heads, while the fool walks in the darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. Then I said to myself, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said to myself, this too is meaningless. For the wise, like the fool, will not be long remembered. The days have already come when both have been forgotten. Like the fool, the wise too must die. So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind." In case you're wondering what this photo is of, I got this from Pixabay. It's books that have been, they use a camera to make a swirling thing. But I thought that really represents the idea of considering wisdom, madness, and folly, and the whole swirl of that going through his mind. But he turns here, after pleasure, to wisdom itself, but as well as foolish behavior and ideas, in addition to looking at wisdom. As Derek Kidner wrote, so he goes back to the great alternatives, wisdom and folly, to compare them and then to assess them radically. Has either of them an answer to this search for something final? He includes in folly not only the madness of self-indulgence and cynicism, but the pursuit of pleasure at any level, even the highest, and as an escape from painful thought that should be faced. So, which is better? Wisdom, foolishness, folly? Which gives you a true meaning for life? Well, his conclusion is that wisdom is better. But there is a but, and we'll get to that in just a minute. He asked the question, what more could his successor do that he had already done? He'd found nothing that he could pass on to his successor to make his way easier. And when we look at Solomon's successor, which was Rehoboam, he really inherited loads of problems, didn't he? But he didn't deal with those very wisely, especially there at the beginning of his reign. So Solomon says, as far as wisdom or foolishness goes, wisdom is to be preferred. He says it's like light being preferred to darkness. In fact, he says the wise Man has eyes in his head so that he can see where he's going, but the fool walks in darkness. By the way, it's the first use of that word fool in this book. And it refers to someone who lacks understanding because he simply cannot be taught. But consider what he's saying there, light being better than darkness. Isn't light better than darkness? When I get up, if I have to get up in the middle of the night, wandering out, I've got to make sure that that path through our house is clear so I don't trip over anything. We've been on hill walks before, and it's gotten dark before we could get off the hill. I tell you, walking down a hill, even though you're on a path, in darkness is very difficult because you can't see precisely where your feet are going. And even with a torch, it makes it difficult to walk in darkness. Light, he says, is better. Wise can see because they have torches. The foolish can't. But then he considers, ultimately, is there really much difference? And the problem, that, as he saw it, was that his being wise didn't protect him from death. Both the wise and the fool die. Derek Kinder comments that for the first time in the book, but by no means the last, the fact of death brings the search to a sudden stop. If one fate comes to all, and that fate is extinction, it robs every man of his dignity and every project of its point. So what he's saying is, if this was the case, that both equally die, then what gain was there in being excessively wise? He could have been foolish and accomplished the same thing. And perhaps we're seeing some of this in our current crisis. This virus does not discriminate. Prince Charles, the Prime Minister, both have it. And my father-in-law, who's a retired engineer, a working man, also has it. See, it doesn't matter how you've lived. You are susceptible. It doesn't matter what your economic level is, what your station in life is. You are susceptible. And that's why we're in this current lockdown, isn't it? That we are told not to mix with anybody so that we don't get the virus. We're also told to wash our hands frequently, especially after we've been outside. This virus, like death, makes no distinctions among people. The benefits of wisdom he found to be utterly meaningless because they can't prevent death. And not only this, neither the wise nor the foolish would be remembered for very long, because people would forget that they both had lived. I enjoy visiting cemeteries. This is a cemetery in Dumfries at the parish kirk there. And you can see there's people, and you can almost read some of the tombstones there, read some of the names. But who really remembers these people? Now, there is one in this cemetery that people do remember. If I was to turn around and show you the picture that I took going the other direction, you see the mausoleum of Robert Burns, the poet of Scotland. Although originally he wasn't buried in this nice fancy mausoleum that was there behind me. He was buried somewhere off, in fact, maybe even on this very row where I'm standing, and basically an unmarked grave, because he wasn't popular during his lifetime. But death comes to us all. And visiting cemeteries really does drive home that point, without a doubt. People just aren't remembered for long. Derek Kidner wrote, "Everything may tell us that wisdom is not on a par with folly, nor goodness with evil. But no matter. If death is the end of the road, the contention that there is nothing to choose between them will get the last word. The choices that we positively knew to be significant will be brushed aside as finally irrelevant." So, was acquiring wisdom what it was all about? Notice Solomon's conclusion. He says, "So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. As Derek Kidner commented, if there is a lie at the center of existence and nonsense at the end of it, who has the heart to make anything of it? If, as we put it, every card in our hand will be trumped, does it matter how we play? Why treat a king with more respect than a knave? If that is what we're all facing at the end of life, and that's the conclusion that Solomon is arriving at. New Time wrote, pursuing luxuries to obtain happiness was like chasing the wind, because in doing so, he was chasing the wrong things. And isn't that true? And we'll get to that in this next section here. Verses 18 to 26, he changes and looks at something else. And again, it's something that I think people today often devote their time to. What about working? What about our careers? And don't we all know people that spend too much time with their career? So let's read verses 18 down to 26. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish? Yet they will have control over all the fruit of my toil, into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This, too, is meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. For a person may labor with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then they must leave all they own to another who has not toiled for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What do people get for all the toil and anxious striving with which they labor under the sun? All their days their work is grief and pain. Even at night their minds do not rest. This too is meaningless. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Derek Kidner comments that verses 18 to 23 look at a smaller grief, but one which can sap the spirit in its own way. The frustrating uncertainty of all our enterprises once they slip from our control, as sooner or later they must. So he's turning to look at the problem of our work. And as he examines work, he does find a problem. And that is we have to leave it all for someone else to continue. In Solomon's case, by the way, that was Rehoboam, wasn't it? What happened to Rehoboam as he began reigning? He lost most of the kingdom of Israel almost immediately. Solomon's reign is generally regarded as possibly the height of Israel as a kingdom. But Rehoboam's, that's when the kingdom divided, although a lot of that was due to bad mistakes that Solomon had made, wasn't it? But Solomon had worked hard, so hard to acquire what he had, yet he's going to have to leave it to someone else. Who knew whether they would be wise or whether they would be foolish? And no matter what type of person he was, he's going to have control over all that somebody else had worked so wisely for. And Solomon looks at all that and he says, that's just meaningless. That is meaningless. So he begins to despair about all the things he had done and all that he had worked for. One man, he says, may do his work with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, but he's going to have to hand over what he built up and acquired as an inheritance to someone who had not worked for it. He says this was not only futile, it was not only meaningless, it was a great misfortune. It's an awful injustice. This whole idea about having to leave it to someone else. So, what does a man get for all his work and worry and anxiety? He says his work produces pain and frustration. And when you're working hard trying to build up a business, he says, even at night, his mind won't let go and relax when he desperately needs rest from his day's work. And he says, this is meaningless. It's just not what gives a purpose to life. As Tennessee Ernie Ford put it in a popular song, and we've probably heard it, all we get is another day older and deeper in debt. Derek Kidner wrote about this. He said, the more he's toiled at his life's work, the more galling will be the thought of its fruits falling into other hands, and as likely as not, the wrong hands. This is yet another blow to the hope glimpsed earlier in the chapter of finding fulfillment in hard work and high attainment. So, his conclusion to all of this, he says, there's nothing better than to eat, drink, and find enjoyment in their work. There's nothing better than a person can do than to at least find some enjoyment in what he's doing. But notice what he discovers. This enjoyment comes from God. It doesn't come from ourselves. It doesn't come from what we're doing. God gives us this enjoyment. After all, it's God who provides all that we have to eat and drink and enjoy. So he's arriving at some pretty good conclusions there. Derek Kidner wrote, the compulsive worker of verses 22 and following, overloading his days with toil, his nights with worry, has missed the simple joys that God was holding out to him. The real issue for him was not work and rest, was not between work and rest, but had he known it, between meaningless and meaningful activity. As verse 24 points out, the very toil that tyrannized him was potentially a joyful gift of God, if only he had had the grace to take it as such. See, with God in a person's life, the outcome becomes different. And Danny Petrillo comments that the challenge in the rest of the book is to consider life with God in it. Because to those who please God, to those who are obedient, Solomon discovers God's going to give wisdom and knowledge and joy. The ability to enjoy the good things of life is a gift from God. After all, if he could do all that he did, and if he, as Solomon, could do all that he did and still not find enjoyment, then no one can. You've got to go elsewhere. And that elsewhere, he discovers, is God. In trying to please God, he's actually arriving very early at the conclusion he's going to reach at the end of the book, isn't he? Derek Kidner commented that, so for a moment, the veil is lifted in verse 26 to show us something other than futility. The book will end strongly on this positive note, but meanwhile, we're shown enough in such glimpses to assure us that there is an answer and that the author is no defeatist. He disillusions us to bring us to reality. But then he looks at somebody not pleasing God. He says, to the sinner, God gives the task of amassing wealth, but wealth that will then be given to the one who pleases God. And he looks at the task of the wicked and says, that's meaningless, that's futile. It's like chasing the wind. Derek Kidner again wrote, the fact that in the end the sinner's hoard will go to the righteous is only crowning irony to what was in any case vanity and a striving after wind. And for the righteous it is a crowning vindication, but no more. Like the meek who are promised the earth, their treasure is elsewhere and of another kind. To the sinner, God has given the task of amassing wealth, but not something that's going to benefit him at all, although it can benefit the righteous. Thomas Hale making an application of this in his applied Old Testament commentary, said, in these verses, the teacher has presented a kernel of truth. Real happiness is only possible when we acknowledge God and try to please Him. The simple pleasures of life can be enjoyed, and needed wisdom can be obtained. And we can discover that when we read Paul's first letter to Timothy and also reading through James. James, by the way, has a lot of parallels with this book and also with Proverbs. It does very much contain a lot of the same wisdom that we find in these two books. Warren Wiersbe commented that it's easy to see why the Jewish people read Ecclesiastes at the Feast of Tabernacles. For Tabernacles is their great time of thanksgiving and rejoicing for God's abundant provision of their needs. So this is something that the religious Jews, even today, during the Feast of Tabernacles, will read as they give thanks for all the things they have. And again, comes from this section of Ecclesiastes, because it's God who gives us the good things in life. Well, what are some of the lessons that we can learn from chapter 2? Let me suggest some that came to my eye as I was going through this chapter. I think we can see the shallowness and emptiness of pleasure, of laughter and folly, how they really do not bring satisfaction to life. We can see that things don't buy happiness. They can't buy happiness and satisfaction. It's interesting how many people think that if I just have the latest whatever it is, that I'll be happy. But of course, once they have that, then there is another latest which they want to have. I think we can also learn that some satisfaction can't be found in our work, but how we view it is our choice. I thoroughly enjoy my work. I enjoy the things that I do because it's centered around teaching God's Word. It's centered around studying God's Word. And I thoroughly enjoy being able to do all of that. But I found some people think that's a bit weird, that I enjoy my work. Of course, my thought is if I didn't enjoy it, why would I do it? But we can find satisfaction, but it's largely how we view it, isn't it? I think we also learned that death comes to everyone, and maybe this current pandemic is really driving that home. That, in fact, they say that before this is over, everyone will know somebody who's died of COVID-19. All that's going on. Death does come to everyone. It is a great equalizer. We can learn as well that we need to store up treasure in heaven rather than leave it for someone else to squander. That's where our emphasis should be, not on amassing wealth here, but making sure there's treasure in heaven, that is the treasure that we can take with us. And then there's that last thing that he had there. We need to learn to enjoy the good gifts God has given us, but don't make the accumulation of things our life's goal. I think that's really the lesson that we can learn from chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes. As Newheim's looking at the experiment, he commented that the experiment has failed. The promise of happiness and fulfillment through the acquisition and unlimited consumption of luxuries was and remains misleading. The visualization of such happiness through unlimited consumption had turned out to be an optical illusion of the mind, similar to the many advertisements which bombard human senses today. Isn't that last part so very, very true? Isn't that the way that advertisements try to sell you something? If you just have this, you will find happiness. If you can just drink this, you'll find your life is so much better. But of course, we find that's not really the way it works. We'll close with this comment by G.S. Hendry in the New Bible Commentary. He said, only by a new wisdom, as wisdom which has a different standpoint and orientation, not the wisdom of this world, nor of the princes of this world, but the wisdom of God in a mystery. And that mystery, of course, is what we have through Jesus, the salvation that he has provided. It's only by having a new wisdom, a wisdom with a different standpoint, that we can really find a life that's worth living. Very much so. There's an advertising campaign a few years ago. Think different. Isn't that really what we're called to do as Christians? To think different, especially about what goes on in the world. Thank you for listening to this, and hopefully you can come back next week and find the third lesson in this particular series.